What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Alan Levinovitz. Alan, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed your recent book, Natural, the appeal of natural, the benefits of it, where it can steer us in the wrong direction. That is going to be the topic of conversation today. But before we dive down that rabbit hole, could you provide the listeners with a little background about yourself for those who might not be familiar with you?
Sure, and they'll probably be a little bit surprised, so that'll be some we can talk about too during the conversation. I'm a professor of religious studies at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and my area of specialty is classical Chinese thought. So I do Proto-Taoist scriptures and Confucian thought and other early classical Chinese thinkers. So a lot of times people wonder how I ended up getting into religion and science or religion and medicine. But one of the things that I discovered while researching classical Chinese and also doing religious studies in general is that a lot of what we scholars of religion, and it's important to distinguish between religious studies professors and religious professors. They're not the same thing. A lot of people are like, oh, so you train people to be priests. That's not what we do. We study religion, and a lot of the tools that I use to study religion, observing rituals, thinking about taboos. This is pure. This is impure. These are the rules that you should use to lead your life. All of those tools can actually be used to help us understand what seems like it isn't religious, just the choices people make when they're figuring out how to feed their baby, or trying to know where they should go on vacation or how they should design their house. Stuff as simple as that often can really be helpfully analyzed through the lenses of religious studies. And that's how I've ended up doing a lot of the work that I do today, whether it's journalism I do or the most recent book that I published.
That's fascinating, especially because I think to a lot of people, when they hear religion and science, these are just concepts that don't go together, right? They're in opposition to one another. But being able to blend these is it's super important. One can infer a lot about the other, and I think it's important that we consider both in the discussion.
Absolutely, and that's a whole nother topic. But the idea that religion and science are opposing forces is, I'm not personally religious, but that sometimes bothers me. Lots of religious people are also very scientifically literate. The head of Francis Collins, head of the NIH, is evangelical Christian and also leader on genetics research. So it's always good to complicate our understandings of how these very important ideas fit together.
Absolutely. So, to begin our discussion today on natural, I think it's really important that we set the stage by, I guess, covering a definition of what is natural. And perhaps you will provide for us an objective definition of what this word means. But I think what we really want to get at here is these associations with the word natural that we have more or less created over time. So, natural meaning good or healthy, especially in the nutrition space. Me being a registered dietitian, there's a fascination with natural food, and oh, if this food is natural, it must be better for me than the alternative product. So I think this starts the conversation well, and the listeners will be really interested to get your take on where these origins stem from and what the word should actually mean.
Yeah, what you've said is spot on. So I think the book, if it accomplishes anything, I hope it will be to make people realize just how closely tied naturalness is with goodness. It's basically a synonym for holy or pure or good in a lot of people's minds. So if something is natural, then it's good and pure and holy. And if something is unnatural, then it is bad and impure and unholy. And the words have been used like that. If you just start to think about it, you'll see it everywhere. As soon as you see it, you can't unsee it, right? So dying of natural causes versus unnatural causes. As I say in the book, if you look through Shakespeare's plays, an unnatural death is, you've been murdered or there's been some kind of subterfuge. Naturalness stands in for the right way, that you should die, that you should be born, that you should eat, that you should get married, everything, right? And that is what I really want to stop people from thinking. Now, at the same time, I think there is a useful definition of natural, and I'll put it like this: natural is, or naturalness is, the state of not having been actively interfered with by humans. So if we think of human beings as having freedom, the ability to choose things, then natural is what has not been chosen by humans. And that can include human instincts, right? So we don't choose certain parts of our behavior. So if people would say you behave that way naturally, what people really mean is you behave that way without choosing to, or that's how you would behave instinctively. Instinct and naturalness are tied, and that's because they're not associated with human interference. So I actually think a fine definition of natural, and this exists on a spectrum, is the extent to which something does or doesn't owe its existence to human choice. And that's where I leave it. So before humans existed on Earth, everything was natural. That's a really nice way to think about it. And after humans existed, to the extent that our choices have helped shape all kinds of stuff, from our own culture to the natural world, then you can label things more or less natural, right? New York City is less natural than, a redwood forest, even though that redwood forest is not purely natural, because human choices really have affected the way in which even the natural world looks today.
Excellent. Now, following this definition, I think one of my goals is to take the listeners more or less on a roller coaster of the positives and negatives of natural. So they'll hear one thing, they'll be like, natural is fantastic. And then they'll hear the next thing, they'll be like, who cares about natural? And I think when I'm reflecting on my audience, and this mostly being an evidence based fitness podcast, most of them will default to science and they'll think to themselves, well, I'm not really concerned with natural. It's like this fad term that doesn't really matter. It doesn't have a whole lot of meaning behind it. It's not necessarily evidence based, or that it's not necessarily evidence based, or that there is this automatic positive benefit from something being natural. As you describe it, natural could be considered a fuzzy factor. It's associated with meaning or sacredness, and it's not an objective description of reality. But with that being said, I want you to provide to the listeners the value of natural, the significance of taking part in natural experiences, and the positive effects that this can have on you as a human being.
Certainly, I don't think there's anyone listening to your podcast who doesn't have some way in their lives, some way, whether it's a house plant or going on a hike or getting out on a sailboat. I mean, I don't know what people do, but some way in which they find that connecting with the natural world is meaningful. And I don't want to use the word therapeutic, but meaning making. And that is because naturalness is what came from beyond and before human beings. So if you think about the word natural, the origins of the word mean birth. It comes from the Latin natura, to be born. And we can think about nature as the thing that gave birth to everything, right? It's the forces, and you don't have to be a religious person to think about it this way. It's just all the forces that led to the world being the way it is today. That's what nature is. And so, to me at least, there's something incredible about that. It's incredible that these forces existed, that we had nothing to do with them, and that they resulted in things like birds and the ocean and beaches. And I'm a rock collector, and I keep all these rocks on my desk because they're bonkers. They're so cool. I mean, the shells. I got this. I don't know if people are just listening or if this is on video. You tell me. But there's a shell. It's called a Venus comb. And to me, it's just like looking at this, it's like, what? We didn't design that. That just came out of nature. Forces beyond and before human beings. That's magical. It's extraordinary. And to the extent that connecting with that magic is valuable and fills you with wonder and awe, I mean, I think that's great. I think that's absolutely terrific. The problem comes when we make that the only measure of what is right or wrong, or when we take that to be a substitute for figuring out whether something is hurting people or killing people or causing people to suffer, right? I mean, to the extent that those forces are magical and wonderful, they're also terrible. They kill. There's endless slaughter of children by these natural forces, and mothers in childbirth, as I talk about in the book. And so it's naive, I believe, to confuse the awe that we feel and the wonder that we feel at the natural world, which is very legitimate and important, with a kind of religiosity that turns nature into a god that can only do good things, and that creates rules for how we ought to organize ourselves and live our lives. Nature, we can love nature without worshiping it.
Absolutely. Something specific to nutrition in your book that comes to mind regarding all of these concepts is that you talked about, I think you ate a piece of cheese at a local farm, and you more or less knew the cow that produced the cheese that you ate, and that was a dramatically spiritual experience, right? And you felt this positive energy from consuming that cheese. And I think that's fantastic. I think people should partake in those experiences. But as you mentioned, and as most people know, those types of products can be more expensive, right? And this kind of slides down the scale of like organic fruits and vegetables. And regardless of the evidence, I think it's fine if someone wants to pay more for organic fruits and vegetables if it makes them feel better. But then, as you mentioned, when we take this too far, the problem arises is that, well, only organic fruits and vegetables are healthful, and that leads to these things like there's research behind this, and that people of low income will literally not buy any fruits or vegetables because they can't afford the organic ones, and they're like, well, I'm not going to get any benefits anyway. They don't taste that good compared to the bag of chips, so like, why would I do this if there's no benefit per se?
Yeah, generally speaking, again, when you worship something, it means it's good in all possible ways. So when you worship nature, what that means then is that the cheese that I eat at the farmer's market, it's not just good because I like knowing the farmer that made my cheese, which is cool. Like, that's a really cool experience. In the same way that it's cool if you know the person that, if you go to, if you get a table that's made by some local artisan, that it's cool that it was made by that local artisan. But it doesn't mean that it's good in all possible ways. And that's what happens when you worship what's natural. All of a sudden people need to believe, well, if I like the feeling of being connected to the cheese, then it must also be better for me. And it must also be better for the economy, and it must also be better for animals. Where, I mean, which is, if you think about it, what a crazy coincidence it would be if the cheese that's good in one way is good in all ways. Right? Everything's got costs and benefits, and engaging with reality and the problems that we face in a responsible way requires not oversimplifying things, and being honest with ourselves about those costs and benefits, and not trying to ignore them or hide them behind some kind of veil of simple binaries like natural and unnatural.
Absolutely. And in reference to that local farm experience and whether, all these things correlate and it's completely positive, you mentioned some things in your book, even a conversation with someone working at that farm about how this is a fantastic thing. I wish more people could enjoy these activities, but at the end of the day, more of us isn't going to solve the worldwide crisis when it comes to a sustainable food system and food security being something that everyone has.
Right. And to the extent that these are complicated problems, I'm guessing that the ideal food system, global food system, to the extent that something like that exists, is going to be a combination of local, what people might understand as natural, right? Things that are less interfered with by humans, agriculture, and extremely not local, highly globalized networks of food production, intensive agriculture of different kinds. The answer is going to be something complicated and diverse. And it's funny, I mentioned this in the book, but a lot of people who really like the idea of natural, the people who sort of worship this idea, one of the things they hate is monoculture, and that refers in crops to the lack of resilience that can come from planting only one kind of crop in one area at one time. And people point to that and say, this isn't natural, that's not how it should work, you need to have polyculture. Well, I say the same thing with ideas. If you monoculture reality by saying that only natural things are good and all unnatural things are bad, you're going to create the same lack of resilience that you would in your monocultured crop area. So that's, I just want people to be a little bit more flexible and less dogmatic with their approach to how they figure out what's right or wrong or good or bad in the food world, in the medicine world, in everything. economics, whatever, all of which are places people would be like, oh, how has it come up in economics? But all of which are places where naturalness becomes a very important concept. I mean, I just saw the other day, what was it, some like finance chair or something, maybe it was Janet Yellen, I forget who it was, saying something about how you want to make sure that we use the natural approach to regulating something. I was like, why is this word even in here, right? We don't want to use the natural approach, we want to use the best approach, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, where natural becomes uncritically a synonym for best, when in fact it doesn't belong there at all.
I love that. Something I repeat a lot and we talk about on the podcast is that if you're interested in getting closer to the truth, as close as possible, then it's probably best practice to be exploring in the shade of gray. If you are on the outskirts and you are accepting something as being either black or white, you're probably not even in the same zip code as where the truth lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, that's good. At the same time, the reason I think humans are attracted to these sorts of simple binaries is because we've got a lot of decisions to make in our life. We got to figure out, you got your baby, you're trying to figure out what to feed them, you're trying to figure out what kind of mattress to buy them, you want to know how to design your house, and that's a lot of cognitive labor. So we need simple heuristics, those are those algorithms for sorting reality into what's right or wrong, good or bad decisions. And that's part of what goes into the strength of the naturalness myth. It's such a powerful heuristic. It makes sense on its face, and there is some science that I understand why people would believe, for example, there's, if we move out of our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, which is a fancy term for organisms evolve in a certain state. And so if you shift them into another environment very quickly, that can have traumatic effects. And we know that from looking at animal ecosystems that change rapidly and seeing the ways in which animals are affected negatively by that. So I can see how people would then jump to the conclusion that all those kinds of shifts are bad. And we should always try to stay in the state that was engineered for us or designed for us by nature, these forces that came beyond and before us. But it's unfortunate, it's just not true, right? Despite our attraction to simplicity, simplicity doesn't map reality accurately.
Yeah, to that point, you cover this wide array of areas where the concept of natural being best is basically at the forefront. And to me, my interpretation of all of this is that perhaps the most powerful thing about natural and associating it with good, like you mentioned, it's simple, but ultimately as humans, we are extremely uncomfortable with uncertainty. So there's this cognitive labor that you mentioned, and it just makes life easier. But what also makes life easier is being certain, right? Because ignorance is bliss. If you don't have to consider X, Y, and Z, and it's just always Y, that makes things really appealing and more comfortable just to live as a person.
For sure. We are, and there's psychology studies that show this. We are uncomfortable. We are averse to uncertainty, and at the same time, right? This is what was sort of fun about writing this book is it just takes the barest minimum of thinking to see how the simplicities that we seek out are so absurd. I mean, taking natural food as one obvious example, none of the plants and animals that we eat that qualify as natural, right? The most natural food enthusiast in the world, even if they're foraging, for heaven's sake, the stuff that they're going to be eating was probably bred at some point or altered by human beings or is growing in a landscape that was created by human beings. There's just simply no way to think about the natural beef that you're eating as actually uninterfered with by humans. And when you bring this sort of thing up, natural eating advocates, people are running, a farm is it's just an unnatural place. I mean, that's just the end of the line, right? But what they'll say is, well, that's not what we mean. What we mean is natural, we mean not genetically modified. That's what we mean by natural. Or we mean we don't use antibiotics. That's what we mean by natural. And to the extent that there are some good arguments for not overusing antibiotics in animals or for using certain kinds of farming techniques that people might label as natural, I like listening to that, and I want those techniques on the table. I just don't want the word natural in there. The reason you don't want to use antibiotics in animals isn't because antibiotics are unnatural. The reason, if you don't want to use antibiotics in animals, is because they don't work well, or because they cause antibiotic resistance, or all of the reasons that we have for wanting to reduce antibiotics use in animals. So it's better if we peel back that word and figure out what it actually means in every case that people are using it, because often it means something reasonable, but it's hard to see that when it's hidden behind such a vague quasi-religious term.
Absolutely. In this context, it's a goal of this evidence-based movement, right? Especially in the realms that I specifically work in. So whether that being training or nutrition, just promoting overall health and wellness, something that is, I would say, perhaps is rising despite this coinciding increase in evidence-based practitioners, is that there's a lot of suspect personalities promoting simple narratives that are just clearly filled with holes, but they have this confident personality, and they have this certainty in that what they're selling is going to fix this person's condition. And for that reason, people are grabbing onto this, and there are so many practitioners that are just more or less being immoral in their practice to a degree. They're putting people's health at danger. But despite what evidence-based practitioners are doing, despite, making articles and being on social media saying, hey, for X, Y, and Z reasons, because of these studies and this research, what this popular person is promoting is dangerous, it doesn't seem like it's making much of an impact. And there's just these differing sides of the fence, and then ultimately you have these personalities, and that one is attracted to science and that nuance, and the other is just simply attracted to the certainty that is being sold. And it's a really difficult obstacle to overcome. And I'm curious about your thoughts on this matter, and perhaps how do we do a better job of overcoming these snake oil salesmen within the industry?
Yeah, so here as a religious studies professor, right? Here's how I approach it, which is there's actually a few ways I have of assessing whether someone is trying to convince me in ways that emerge out of evidence, or whether they're trying to appeal to these kinds of simple narratives. So you'll find almost always, as a rule, health gurus that are selling you BS will almost always say that their BS is natural, and they will almost always say that it comes from somewhere ancient. And those are actually related, because if you think about naturalness using the definition I gave, which is uninterfered with by human beings, then the further back you go, the less interfered with something will be. So ancient and natural are very similar. They both have this sense of going back to the origin. And that in turn is tied to a story that anyone, whether they study religion or not, is very familiar with, which is this idea of a Garden of Eden, a pure paradise in the past, where everything was great and everyone was happy and no one got sick. And they all had ripped abs. And then all of a sudden, they messed with reality. They made the wrong choice. They fell out of that paradise. They started having to do agriculture, right? This was Eve's punishment, right? That was Adam's punishment. Eve had pain in childbirth, right? So this story of a paradise past that we fall out of because of our interference, and the desire to return to that paradise through some kind of, I don't know, simple dietary trick or approach to exercise. I see that everywhere. And for me, that's when alarm bells go off. If I see someone using those narratives to promote whatever it is they're promoting, then I wonder, what are they hiding? Why are they saying it this way? You see this all the time. You see with vegans, right? You'll hear stuff like it's not human beings' natural way of eating. Low carb carnivore advocates, they'll be like, that's veganism is not the natural way to eat, right? So everyone from whatever dietary camp they're in, they're always using that argument. They'll say, if you go back into the past, this is how our hunter-gatherer ancestors insert whatever it is that they're selling you, right? They moved this way, they ate this way, they dressed this way, whatever it happened, they didn't wear shoes, and that's, you get a long way, honestly, just keeping an eye out for that. As soon as you see that, you think to yourself, okay, I want to look a little. I want to look a little bit harder at this. In the same way, also that it's unlikely that something is good in all possible ways. That the cheese is good in every way for the economy, for your health. It's unlikely that a single approach to food is going to be good for everyone in all ways. There's probably going to be some people that thrive depending on your culture, right? I mean, it's going to be easier or harder to eat low carb or high carb or vegetarian or not. I learned this when I went to China, which, I lived in China for 2 years, and there were a lot of expat vegetarians there who very quickly realized that it was very hard to be vegetarian in China. And you wouldn't think so. People actually eat a lot of vegetables in China, especially poor people, because meat is expensive. But they use meat almost as a seasoning often. So you get like tiny flakes of pork in dishes to add flavor to them. And so here was a place where actually, for a lot of people, they ate less meat, but it wasn't a kind of purity thing. It wasn't no meat, right? It wasn't, the only vegetarians were the Buddhist monks at the, or the people running the Buddhist vegetarian restaurant. And so your culture is going to have a lot to do with what's right for you. Your own physiology is going to have a lot to do with what's right for you. And the simple rules of natural and unnatural that health gurus depend on for the almost religious devotion that they inspire, those get in the way of that diversity of approaches, which actually fits better with our diversity of human experience and ways of being.
Yeah, I think those points are tremendous because ultimately people want things to be simple, and that's why these simple narratives are appealing. But based on those strategies you proposed, we can combat these simple narratives with equally simple heuristics, looking at, okay, I see these words and everything is good. So this must mean that something is suspicious, which generally speaking would be a much more effective approach than linking 4 studies from PubMed
Yeah.
and saying, hey, go read these.
Yeah, exactly. No, there's so for example, I'll give you an example that in real time. There's some guy I've seen, and maybe your listeners have heard about him, maybe you've heard about him. He's like, I want to say he's from Norway. He's like this ice guy. He like loves jumping into really cold water or something. He's got this beard, and I've seen photos of him occasionally. And I bet you, I don't know anything about this guy, but I guarantee you that if you look into the kind of stuff that he's talking about, he's going to say this is the natural something something something, right? This is back in the day when Norwegians were strong and never got sick, right? So there's going to be this back in the day narrative, and there's going to be a natural narrative. I guarantee it, right? And I got nothing against jumping in ice cold water to feel good. If that works for people, if it's invigorating, that's terrific. And if there's scientific evidence that it's good in certain ways, that's terrific too. But I'm betting that that's not how the story is getting told. I'm betting, just judging from the way in which people seem to look up to him, that he's also using these other narratives, these stories that are borrowed, mythic stories that are borrowed from religion in order to make his case. And that's I get it, right? We all want to make meaning for ourselves, and we all have stories that we like to tell to situate ourselves in a world that's meaningful. But at the same time, those stories can become problematic. And whether they are explicitly and exclusively religious, or whether they are religion hidden in the guise of science, right? Natural sounds like a normal scientific word until you realize that when people say things like nature designed us to do this or nature wants us to do that, that it's just really just substitute for God, right? Nature doesn't want anything. Nature doesn't care about us at all. That disguised religion using the language of science can be problematic. It can distort things, and we don't want that. Ultimately, I think all your listeners and myself, we want something that's true. And truth is complicated, and there's a lot we don't know.
Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it. Continuing with this theme, I thought your perspective on the whole realm of alternative medicine was truly fascinating in the fact that you discussed alternative medicine in the concept of cancer treatment, right? And foregoing traditional methods like radiation and chemo for in exchange for, the I don't know, excessive doses of vitamin C and all of these other very mysterious ways that will apparently treat cancer. And you made the point that, we can all day we can report these institutes and we can try to get them to go out of business due to their unethical practices, but they're going to keep popping up, and there's probably good reason for that. So I would really like you to expand on perhaps the current insufficiencies within the conventional healthcare system and just what is so appealing about alternative medicine.
Absolutely. I'll take one of the words that you used and push back on it a little bit as a way of my example. So you said mysterious ways, and they are mysterious scientifically in the sense that there's no evidence for high doses of vitamin C fighting cancer, but they're not mysterious. Natural medicine, which is often bound up with alternative medicine, is not mysterious, or at least it doesn't appear mysterious to the people that use it. And that's actually essential to understanding why people like it. We live in a society, to use a term from academic studies of technology, that is epistemically opaque. And what that means is that we don't feel like we understand how the stuff around us works. I don't understand how my computer works. I have no idea. If something goes wrong with it, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what to do. I just have to take it to some kind of specialist, right? My car, it used to be you could pop the hood of your car and like you could sort of figure it out and every car kind of worked the same. Now it's like, I don't know what's going on under this hood. I have to take to a very specialized dealer. One mechanic can't work on it, right? So they're opaque. You can't see what's going on. The same is true for medicine. A lot of people don't understand how their medicines work. When the doctor prescribes something, the medicines have these weird alien names like Zaloxar or Patansic or whatever. You don't know what the heck is going on. Whereas with natural medicine, you know exactly what's going on. It's from nature. It's restoring you to your natural state. Usually there's a narrative that cancer happens because of unnatural things, right? So all of a sudden, the complicated world that we live in, the medicine that's opaque, the doctors that aren't listening to you and don't explain things to you, that's all replaced by an epistemically transparent system of medicine in which you know exactly, or feel like you know exactly how things work, you know exactly why you get sick, you know exactly how you're going to get well. And that's really important. It's empowering, which is a word that comes up all the time on these alternative medicine and nutrition health gurus, right? Empowerment is central. And what they mean by that is, I'm going to make you feel like you are the agent, that you understand what's going on, that you're in control. And to the extent that our medical system does not do an adequate job of that when people are sick, that's a problem. And if we don't do an adequate job of that, these alternative healthcare and natural healthcare facilities are going to keep popping up to serve the very real need of human beings to feel like they are in control of themselves and they understand what's going on with themselves, especially when you're dying, because there's no more important time to feel like you're in control than when you're sick. And I'm not saying this is true for everyone. Obviously, a lot of people are fine going to conventional medical facilities, but the minority who are attracted to natural medicine, that's what's going on. And I know, I visited this place in Florida, clinic in Florida, a natural healing clinic that has contributed to the deaths of multiple people who have foregone conventional cancer therapy. Is tragic and horrible. But as I say in the book, there were a lot of plants there. It was nice. If I was sick, I would want to be in a place with a lot of plants. There were trees everywhere. The sun was out. Very different from the bleached white walls and fluorescent lights and stainless steel of a hospital, which feels lifeless. And to the extent that we associate, again, nature, these forces beyond and before human beings, with wonder and life and awe, right? They really did give birth to life, right? Natural forces are responsible for life. I get why people would want to be in an environment that symbolically communicates to them their participation in life-giving forces. So all of that is a part of why natural health is so appealing. And of course, there's gonna be a lot of people on this listening to this. I've encountered this a lot, right? Who are like, well, that's not true. There's plenty of natural things that work. And I'm actually not saying that natural things don't work, right? Yeah, drink some tea with honey for your cough. It's gonna be great. There's all kinds of quote unquote natural interventions that work, not because they're natural though, but because they work, right? Exercise works. Exercise is as close to a miracle as you can get for your health as any medicine, natural or unnatural, in the world. But it's not because exercise is natural. That's not why. Exercise is good for you because it's good for you, and that's sort of the end of the line. So yes, it's true that some things people label natural are good for you, but the reason they are good for you is not because they're natural. In the same way that we would never do that with unnatural things. It's one of the things I always point out to people, right? People say, oh, this is good for you because it's natural, but there's plenty of stuff that we use all the. It's not like cars are good for getting us to places because they're unnatural. Like that would be a really weird logic. Why we would never attribute causality to unnaturalness. My glasses work because they're unnatural. And so it's funny when you think about how people think that natural is just a reason for something to be causing a good effect, but we would never do the same thing with unnatural. It's just the flip side of the coin.
I love that. I think it might be the snippet for the episode. It works because it works, not necessarily because it's natural, and by default, it's going to work because it's natural. Something in mind in regard to the conventional medical system and the attractiveness of these facilities promoting natural alternative medicine is it's probably a bit more personable in those environments, right? I feel like the leading practitioners spending a lot more time with the patients, and they're getting to know them a little bit better, and in combination with this certainty and higher agency that the individual is experiencing, they're also connecting more with the person who is in charge of their care. I think that's extremely important, and I might get roasted for this as a dietitian, but these are just my thoughts on the topic, and I've discussed this with other practitioners in the field. Something about being a dietitian in the clinical setting that can be unsettling at times is that it's almost like it's a factory conveyor belt of humans, and it's just like, how many patients can you get to in a day? And it's like, here's your chart, you got 30 patients, you got an 8-hour workday, like get to all of them. And by a consequence of that, it's like, okay, step into a room, 3-minute spiel, here's a handout. Whereas in reality, if I really want to improve that person's nutritional habits and make a difference in their life so they don't come back into the hospital, because there's a good chance this person has been in the hospital a few times in the past several months and nothing has gotten better, I would need to sit down with that person for an extended period of time and really get an understanding of their unique circumstances and lay out the changes that they could feasibly make to their approach.
I couldn't agree with you more. The time part is not just about empowerment. I'm actually working on an article right now, hopefully to be out soon, about people who are suffering from long COVID, right? So symptoms of COVID that go on for a long time. And one of the things I found, really deeply reporting this, is the extent to which a lack of time spent with patients is enormously problematic. So you've got these people coming in, it's a poorly understood condition. You can't take a patient's record in 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 12 minutes or whatever these doctors have to get to know their patients. And so complexity goes out the window. If it's a condition that you can't understand, you're likely to dismiss the patient, attribute their problems to something simple like anxiety or obesity or whatever it happens to be. And then what do these patients do? They feel, understandably, they feel ignored. They feel like this is bad medicine, which it actually is. It is bad medicine not to spend any time with your patients. And they find someone else who does that part of medicine better. And we need to change that. It's a 5-alarm fire in our medical system. Exactly what you described, the way in which a clinician is going to look at their day and they're going to say, I got 30 people here. I don't have time to spend 20 minutes talking with this person about their history. I don't have time to take a history. I don't have time to look through this stack of records and the more complicated people's problems, right? I mean, I actually talked to this one physician who said to me, we got taught in residency, if they've got more than 3 allergies, run, you know, and, I understand what he's saying, because what he's saying is really that's a heuristic for doctors about which patient is going to take up your time, which patient's going to be problem, which patient's going to have a condition that's not easily diagnosed like diabetes, right? So why spend time with that person? You got 10 people out in your waiting room that you can diagnose in 3 minutes. Why spend 25 minutes listening to someone who you might not be able to diagnose? And that's just, it's unjust and it's unfair. And I am sympathetic to people who are radicalized against conventional medicine because of their experiences with this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In that context, you really can't blame them to a degree. I want to talk about the foreword in your book. It touched my soul, so to speak. A particular sentence that really stuck out to me was that you were more or less conversing with someone, and you were like, "Oh, I bet you don't buy organic bananas." Like that scheme about how paying more for organic produce and it's not necessarily better for your health. Like, what a waste of money, am I right? And the guy was like, not so fast. So with that being said, tell the listeners about the process of writing your book, kind of where you were coming from, your original thoughts, and perhaps how your position changed as you did more research and really grounded your thoughts on these topics.
Yeah, so that example, I mean, I'll bring it out a little bit. I was talking to someone who was an expert on pesticides, and I was certain, here's the science-based person, they're not going to buy organic stuff. And I realized that I was in my own simple heuristic. I had gone into this book thinking anyone who ever values what's natural is always wrong. Anytime you think naturalness is important, it's always stupid. That was my simple way of organizing reality. And this guy pointed out that actually, like there are certain plants where pesticide use as it is used today can really be bad for workers. And so he takes that into account when he's trying to decide whether or not to buy organic. Animal welfare is something where people I respect. There's a great reporter on food, Tamar Haskell at the Washington Post, who's also really nuanced about food. And she said, meat that is labeled organic, depending on which animal, again, it's nuanced, it's complicated, can be good shorthand for better animal welfare. In other contexts, or if you care about different things, your health, for example, eating the organic bananas might not make a difference. And what I realized in that moment was that I also, I was a hypocrite if I didn't take that same call for nuance and apply it to myself. So like I've said, I went into the book thinking I was going to debunk, this was going to be in the same way that Richard Dawkins proves there is no God kind of thing. I was going to prove that naturalness is meaningless. It's not meaningless. It is an important concept. It's a valuable concept. It's useful in science as a hypothesis generating heuristic. So if you're trying to figure out why a particular animal is suffering in a certain ecosystem, like I've said, you might say, hey, is it because of a departure from its natural environment? Now, at the same time, I'll give an example. It's very obscure for a project I'm working on right now, but climate change, right? People associate climate change. You always hear about how it's bad for animals, bad for the environment. Antarctic moss right now is something I'm researching. It sounds very dull, but it's actually fascinating. Antarctic moss loves the change, loves the global warming because it creates more environment where moss can grow and more of a time period where moss can grow. So it is not always the case that unnatural changes are going to be bad for every organism. And so, yes, naturalness is a good heuristic for thinking about reality. It's a valuable concept. Sometimes departures from it are bad, but we need to be careful with that. And the solutions to all of our problems, whether it's climate change or environmental degradation or personal health, they're necessarily going to involve a very complicated set of compromises between both ends of the natural and unnatural spectrum. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're impure. You don't have to reject all value of naturalness or reject all unnatural things to be a good human being, right? Let's take the religion out of this. Like I said, there's something I want people to take from this book is you can love nature without worshiping it. That's really, really important.
Yeah, as we discussed before going on air, I mentioned how just eerily balanced your book is, just both sides of the fence, where the value is. And coming into it, I thought it was just going to be a science expose. Here's 10 different ways why natural will steer you wrong. And I don't know, maybe that's because it's due to the title, right? Natural, how faith
Yeah.
in nature's goodness leads to harmful fads, unjust laws, and flawed science.
I'll tell you, Mike, I fought with the publisher on that.
Oh,
My
really?
British book has a different subtitle. British book is called The Myth of Natural Goodness, which is much less combative and polemical. And I fought with my publisher. And one of the things my publisher said, and they're probably right, is you don't sell books with a nuance and balance. You sell books as like, I'm going to debunk them, I'm going to tear it apart, right? You're going to own them, right? This guy got destroyed online. Um, I don't know. Maybe my next book I'll have a little bit more clout with the publisher. But that's a part of the problem too, right? Is that we live in an information ecosystem that rewards exactly the kind of approach that I'm trying to tell people not to take. You know?
Yeah, and that's why I loved your book, because just every chapter is littered with nuance. I recently made a post about this, and it was that nuance is an endangered species, and its habitat is just being incrementally deforested by the next clickbait article title or the attractive soundbite where it misses the other 2 minutes of nuance within the soundbite, but it's just like, oh, we'll take this 15-second snippet. Nobody will look at the rest of it, and it's just like these simple and plain answers. And just how you mentioned, you can be a quote unquote evidence-based practitioner and be so devoted to the science that it's just completely devoid of nuance, just like you can be a quack selling simple narratives and also be devoid of nuance. And it's just, books like this are phenomenal. There's so many books nowadays where it's just like, here's my point that I'm going to make and let me sell it to you, and I'm going to provide references for the things that support my points, but ultimately you're going to read this and feel that this is one way. And that was not the intention of your book whatsoever. I think you mentioned that the point of the book was the significance of natural, not whether it's good or bad, just understanding what it is and
Yeah,
where the significance
that's
lies.
hugely important, right? I mean, one of the things I just wanted to figure out at first was, what do people mean when they say this? And they just mean wildly different things. I mean, the Chinese word for natural, 自然, which means self-so or so of itself, is sort of freedom from interference. So that's one thing people mean by natural. Another thing people mean is like it was in the past. Another thing people mean is separate from humans. Another thing people mean is healthy. Another thing people mean is safe, right? So that's, you know, that's that's important, right? We want to know what people are saying. We want to clarify our terms. If you clarify terms, there's something in classical Chinese thought called the rectification of names. A complicated idea, but basically what it comes down to is you want terms to line up with what they are. You want people to behave in accordance with how they're labeled, and you want labels to apply to what they are labeling. And so clarity about terms is really important. And to the extent that I'm really sympathetic to the people who are anti-quack and pro-science, I hate when people manipulate these terms in exactly the ways that contribute to our not being able to understand what people really mean. So,
Terrific. Alan, that is all the questions I have for you today. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I really appreciate your time. I enjoyed this chat. So
yeah,
for
I hope your listeners get something out of it. I know I'm probably not the typical guest religious studies professor, probably the only one you'll have on your podcast, but I really enjoy and I'm grateful for having people like you and your listeners, give me an audience, and I hope people find something in it that's helpful.
I absolutely think they will. I mean, we talk a lot about muscle hypertrophy on this podcast, but we're also, equally fond of cranium hypertrophy. Let's get that brain thinking a little bit more. I mean, the symbol for the podcast, it's like this play on the thinking man that's like pretty buff. And that's the point, right? We want to hypertrophy all of it. We want to think critically. We want to build ourselves up in every facet of our life.
I feel you. I want to get back out on my erg as soon as my back injury clears up. It helps me think.
Fantastic. I've noticed the same thing with exercise. So my best posts, the ones where I really get my point across and it's clear, are made while I'm in the gym, to be completely honest.
There you go. It's because the gym is natural.
Alan, for our listeners who want to go learn more about you and support you, where can we point them towards?
You can Google my name, Alan Levinovitz, and find all kinds of articles. I as you might imagine, write about a lot of stuff, everything from, AI and Go to natural health, politics, whatever you want. And so Google my name. I'm on Twitter at Alan Levinovitz. And then my books, latest book, Natural, I think is a really good place to get a sense of what it is that I'm doing, kind of work I'm doing.
I strongly encourage everyone to check out those resources, and they will be linked in the show notes. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
All right. Bye bye.